Welcome back to the program Moneyline with Nancy Tees, and I am Nancy Naji, of course. My guest is here, Professor Kenife, who is a development economist. I did say earlier that we'll be talking about a potpourri of issues. So, Prof, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think it's best we start with the monetary policy. The Monetary Policy Committee is a policy setting committee. It's a policy setting body. In case for people that don't understand what they do, they meet 6 times a year to decide basically on interest rates, liquidity ratio, and the cash reserve requirement. The committee is made up of some officials of the central bank and those that are not also in the central bank appointed by the president. So I just needed to give you a background. The November meeting is the final meeting for 2022. How important is the final meeting for 2022 and the decisions?
Very important, because this is the the Yuletide period, and there's so much that is going on in the economy right now. You've seen flood impacting food supply. You've seen new currency and the dynamics around new currency. And then you've also seen that during the Christmas period, there's a lot of spending. Inflation tends to go up. GDP also picks up with inflation. So there are things going on that they may want to, make sure that they look at what might happen November, December, and early January before they have another meeting. So it's a very, very important meeting for them.
Okay. Very important. And let's take a look at it from the angle of okay, CBN's MPC final meeting of 20. Can we remove that, guys, please? Because the meeting has already started, and the final meeting of 2022. Let's take a look let's take a look at it with the context of the meetings of this year, Prof. Okay. If you take a look at it, the MPC has so far increased rate 3 times. They did in May, they did in July, and they did at the last meeting in September. We've seen interest rates from at least the whole of this year, anchoring at around 11.5%. And that 11.5% was set, I think, around September 2020. It was dragged till,
That's right.
till May, when it was increased to 13%. What would you say about the MPC meetings so far in 2022, and how the policies have really affected the monetary, how the policies have really affected the transmission of monetary policy in the economy?
Well, MPC was rather more patient with the economy, and because they were more pro-growth, at least in the first half of this year, even though the alarm bells were ringing, other economies were increasing their MPR rates, and inflation was jumping in many other economies. But they were more sympathetic to the growth agenda, to make sure that they don't impede growth by pushing. But it came to a point at the middle of the year when they really necessarily had to begin to increase rates. Because again, the inflation was running out of hand. So, which is not really down to monetary policy alone. There are many other things contributing to that. But they now began to respond, because there is a big spread between the inflation and the MPR rates. Theoretically, you need to have that as narrow as possible. If arguably, you really need to have the rates ahead of the inflation, so that you can have positive interest rate rather than negative interest rate. The danger in having negative interest rate, the MPR rate now is 15%, but the inflation is 21%. So you can see it's a negative, quite a big gap, and that discourages portfolio investment. Because what are the portfolio investments coming to do? The foreign portfolio, they want to come in and get not only a high interest rate from you, but also it has to be a positive interest rate difference. Because by the time they collect their money, it would have been eaten up by inflation. You know what I mean? So you invest your money maybe at an interest of 10%, 11%, but by the time you come 12 months after to collect, inflation is already 22%. So it's eating up all the gains that you have. So that does discourage. Even other instruments like bonds and treasury bills, they are all still trending below the MPR rate. And you know that the bank's charges or their bank interest rate take a cue from monetary policy rates, because that is the baseline. That's the interbank lending rates. So they have to charge higher. And they are also charging...
Prof, sorry to cut you short. So you mean that they have to charge higher than the interest rates?
Yes.
That's the interbank rates, is that what you said?
No. The interbank rate is the baseline. The banks can... This is the rate at which the banks... It's the rate at which the banks go to central bank to borrow money. So how can they lend to you at 15%?
Yes.
So how can they lend you lower than that?
They can't lend you
lower than that. They cannot lend you lower than that. So they have to have a margin.
Yeah.
And then the thing is that the margin increases depending on the amount of money available to them to lend. And this is one of the big arguments about printing a new currency, because we have so much going on in that currency field, the ones that are not out of circulation, because the banks need that money. If you say 2.6 trillion is not within the banking sector, you're actually saying that 2.6 trillion, which the banks could have lent to businesses, to invest in business, to create jobs, is not there. So the little that they have to charge you higher interest on that, because 30% of their money has to be kept as liquidity ratio. 32.5% has to be sterilized and kept with the central bank, not earning them any interest.
Okay.
So, and then the loan to deposit ratio has pushed up to 60%, making sure that they tie their lending to the real sector. So they don't have rooms anymore. And then the little that they have to charge a higher interest rate to enable them cover all that they are losing, and they are forced to. So that's part of the problem.
Okay, Prof, I would like you to explain more of that liquidity ratios stuff which you mentioned earlier, because the 2.5% is the reserve they have to leave. They live with the central bank. With the central bank, which you said they don't earn interest rate. But the liquidity ratio is 30%.
Yeah, that is the amount of their capital that they have to keep there, because this liquidity ratio is to make sure that they are liquid. Because if there's a run on the bank, people want their money, there's panic. The bank has to have enough cash to settle their debts before there's an intervention. So that's why the bank needs to make sure. And even capital adequacy ratio is 15% or more. Yeah. And then you have also issues like poor non-performing loans that are actually they put pressure on the bank lending, because these people, they have got your money and they're not returning, they're not paying back. When you loan out, you want them to be repaying so that you have more to loan, but when they are holding it back, it's more problem for the bank.
Okay, Prof, do you think that the Central Bank of Nigeria's MPC have really been successful at tackling inflation? If we take a look at beginning of this year, where inflation was at beginning of this year, guys, can we put that slide, can we put the graph? Because I'm trying to remember what inflation was in January. But I know it was around 15%, and it started going up. January inflation to where we are right now, 21.09% in October. So do you think that the central bank has really been successful? If you take a look at inflation, is that it there? February is supposed to be 15.72%. And March 15.92%. That's it.
The first two numbers are not correct.
Yes. So January is 16%. February is 15.92%. March is also 15.76%. So if you take a look at that, how do you think that we've gone so far?
Now, you see, one thing you need to realize is that the inflation is not only subject to monetary policy. There's a lot more on the fiscal space that are driving inflation. That's why I say there is you have structural factors that are push inflation. When the gas has gone up, electricity has gone up, the road transport costs have gone up, because the diesel, which is what the transport system is using, are gone up 300%. Then the impact is that the man who is producing to sell to the community or to export is experiencing high cost. That thing has nothing to do with monetary policy. So they put pressure on inflation. And then, of course, there's imported inflation element, which is the one to do with Forex and the pricing around Forex. Then you have the demand pull inflation, where more than 100 million people outside Nigeria in the neighboring countries are pulling our food because the currency is cheaper to them. So there are those three inflation drivers. And so you can't come to central bank and say, central bank, you are responsible for all this inflation. No, it's not true. Okay. Now, having said that, the MPC tries as much as possible to deal with what it could access, because it cannot access 80% of the money that is supposed to be in circulation, because 2.6 trillion are out there only out of 3.3 trillion. So, you know, the banks where they're supposed to be influencing the money supply within the banking sector, they just haven't got, they're only, you know, confined to less than one third of what they, you know, they just haven't got it. So you begin to add this up. I know we're going to talk about multidimensional policy. You are looking at over 40% in the poverty line. You have over almost 60% that are poor. Then you have only 40% are not even in the banking sector. Then you have, you know, you begin to add all that, and they say, so the monetary policy that we are using, instrument to control the money in circulation, how effective can that be when you have such a narrow scope to you know?
So in essence, or in other words, what can the monetary policy do?
Now,
because if you're saying that it's out of also their purview, because other sectors or other anchors must support the transmission, yes.
They have
that means, is there any need of meeting anymore?
No. Please. There are
do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I understand you.
Prof, because if we take a look at from the beginning of the year.
Let me explain something.
Yes.
There are three major areas in the scope of central banks' work. One is maintaining financial system stability. They have zero tolerance on financial system instability. Zero tolerance. Our banks are stronger today than they were in 2014. They are strong. The banks are returning 18.3% growth rate. Even during the 2020, when we had COVID, the banks were posting 15% growth rate. Why? Because CBN made sure they invested in payment infrastructure, which means with USSD, with your Nokia to Nokia, you are transacting, which means that you have agency banking everywhere. Over 2 million people are carrying POS all over the place. People don't have to go to banks anymore. So they are doing their bit in all this cashless policy thing. So that means that some of the measures you use to measure the banking sector, which is non-performing loan, which Prudential guidelines says has to be 5%, they are very close to 5%. Capital adequacy ratio 15%, they are doing even better. So they are doing well. So the health, the indices that you use to measure the health of the financial system are sound. And the banks are not exposed to all the stress. Okay, so that's. Second one is price stability. Which is the inflation. Price stability is a big problem because what a price? Inflation is there is demand and supply side. Forex, you have demand and supply side. Even MPR rate, everything that is called price is all subject to demand and supply. Well, even though our economy is very diversified at the domestic sector, but at the foreign sector, the revenue we get from Forex is so small. No, 79% of it is crude oil. You are not seeing it. 10% is gas. Then you have only 10% that is within the purview of the CBN to play with. Diaspora remittance has dropped from 26 billion to just over $5 billion. Foreign direct investment is neither here nor there, very slow in coming, partly because of infrastructure deficit. Then you have portfolio investment that is also suffering. And it's all because of what is going on globally. Every country America is sniffing life out of everybody. So that's that. Now, but having said that, so the world is the bank. The reason why the Forex revenue had dried up is because MPC was supposed to be sending in $3 billion every month of crude revenue to central bank. All it's sending is 300 million, which is 10%. And then the CBN has to disburse $1.8 billion every month for imports. You are getting only 300 million. You are supposed to disburse $1.8 billion. The money is not, the equation doesn't add up. So what happens then? The traders are going to the BDC market to buy currency. There's speculation going on our naira. And then you have laundering, you have election, you have so many things going on there that makes the price, that pushes the price of the Forex. So whatever they import, they will pass it through to the consumers. And then you have not banned import. We don't want to ban import, but we have to manage the demand for import. So the CBN, the demand is $1.8 billion every month. The actual demand for importers is $4.6 billion. CBN is getting only 300 because the direct swap arrangement between NMPC and those refining crude for them is take the crude and give me back PMS. Where does that happen? You don't know how much crude they are sending out. We don't know how much fuel is coming in. And in the two, they turn back to government and say, well, I'm the sole importer and sole exporter. Look, your balance is that you are owing me 500 billion every month. That is, they don't no longer call it subsidy, they call it under recovery. So government go and borrow 500 billion every month to subsidize what they are doing. So you are not only subsidizing the real cost of the fuel coming in, but a lot of padding on that transaction by opaque supply. You don't know what you're supplying. Opaque import. You don't know how much crude you are importing. And then, of course, the overhead of NMPC has gone very high. They are maintaining 4 refineries with not producing any fuel, paying salaries. There are so many dead weights that they are carrying, and all of them are translating to all we're paying out and calling them subsidy.
Prof, let's take a look at the anatomy of Nigeria's inflation. Because if you take a look at, I mentioned earlier where we started from, that's 15.72 in February, 15.92, we've seen a steady rise of inflation. Break down for me really this makeup of inflation and why it is difficult to tame this inflation, especially this year. At least in the last few years, if we have inflation that is high, after a few measures taken by the monetary authority and, especially by the monetary authority, you see that inflation will come down. But this is refusing. This is like, it's a recalcitrant inflation. So speak to me about why this inflation is really different from other types of inflation that we have experienced.
Okay. If you look at the components of inflation, there's 5 of them. The one is called the Composite Price Index, CPI, which is the headline inflation. Now, that is the one that you are putting down on the table there. That's what you are seeing.
Yes.
16.8, 17, 20, 20, 21. There's a second one that is called Food Basket Sub-Index. That cruises at a much higher level than this. It's always giving it 3% headroom. So which means now that it's 21%, that should be 23 point something
That's
percent.
for food inflation.
Food inflation.
Yes.
But that food inflation has 2 sub-components: imported food and farm gate food.
Prices. Yes.
Prices. Anything imported, whether it's processed food or whatever, comes with imported inflation.
What does that mean?
No, wait.
Imported inflation
means that those food were purchased by money that they got from BDC. Okay. And they got very high dollar at nearly 900 and something naira to a dollar, almost twice what it will be sold officially. They just what they used to buy it, and they have to pass through that inflation straight down.
Okay, Prof, sorry.
So that is imported inflation component.
Okay, I need to ask you before you be. I wanted to clarify this imported part, which you have said is the BDC component that the FX needed is gotten from the parallel market or the BDC. How about the inflation in those countries where they are produced?
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
I'm coming to that because why that is a challenge for us. Nigeria is an import-dependent economy, which means Baba has asked you, eat what you produce and produce what you eat. CBN has tried to discourage 43 items from being imported, but they can't stop them, and they haven't tried to stop them. But they are still active there in the BDC market, getting dollar and importing them, so they are still importing them. Now, what you are importing from Europe, for example, is already subject to a very high inflation because 30% of 40 to 40% of the gas that they are using in Europe is coming from Russia. And then a lot of the wheat that they are using is from Ukraine. So they are subject to very high inflation now. And we're still importing their goods. And the goods we're importing from them have been marked up by inflation. So we are just importing all that into our country. Whereas if we were patronizing our own goods and using our own food and all that, using cassava to make bread or putting a lot of it and the others, we will cut down on those. But that's what's happening. Then the third one is the core inflation. Now, core inflation is all inflation indices minus food sub-basket index. Now, what then happens, because you now see that core, is the lowest inflation item. It's usually 17 point something %. You've now seen a gap between it and the headline. So the headline is 21%. The core inflation is about 17. It's not up to 18 yet. It's about 17 plus.
So the core inflation is all other inflationary
indices
minus food.
Food sub-basket.
So does it also include the headline?
No, the headline is the aggregate average.
Yes.
Is the average of everything. So that's why the headline sits between the headline or the composite price. Composite means aggregation. That one sits between the real man causing the problem, which is food sub-basket index, and the core. The core is everything minus the food sub-basket index. But then there are two others that give you an idea of the theater of inflation and what the components could be. And that's the urban inflation. Urban inflation has actually gone higher than headline. It usually slays below, but it has gone higher to say today the heartbeat of inflation is in the urban area. Whereas the rural inflation index is much lower. Is much lower. Now, that tells you the difference between the two is because the processed food, the imported food are being consumed in the urban area. Mostly. These imported items, car parts, all of that, they are being consumed more in the urban area. Secondly, if you are transporting food from rural area to urban area, there's inflation because the diesel is being used to transport them. Yeah. So all the other things, the differences, the services, if you increase electricity, is more in the urban area. No, they don't have power. So all the other things that we are increasing, that are they're all in the urban area. The manufacturing factories that are experiencing problems, all in the urban area. So that explains the difference. Now, we are having challenges in bringing this down because if you look at the current trend in the last 3 months, the food basket sub-index is coming down in real term. That is, in other words, on a month-to-month, it's coming down. But the other ones are pushing it up because don't forget, in that food sub-basket, you have imported food. So it's still going up because the dollar is going up. Then secondly, you have flood. Flood has destroyed over 200,000 hectares of our rice farm. It's all under flood. Now, what means is you're going to have more challenges around food price now. And I was telling the Minister of Finance, release the grains now, the strategic reserves. Release them now before the panic will set in on food prices. And then give some license to some people to bring in some paddy for process. Otherwise, they will sack the workers.
To import paddy.
Yes, for them to process so that they don't sack their workers. So you already have redundant workers and the farmers, not because they've lost their food in the flood. You're now going to have workers leaving their job because they are not processing, no rice to process. So import paddy, and then of course you need to import some to bridge the thing by having some rice in the strategic reserve, some finished rice. So those are the things that have to happen now. And don't forget that as this is going on, there was a heavy demand for dollar last month, and the month before. Children starting school, people going for all kinds of holiday coming back, and then you have importers paying for the import for Christmas. So, and as they are paying for this import and coming in, you now have Christmas demand. Christmas demand is always highest in the country. That comes to inflation as well, but it helps growth because the growth will record, GDP will record increased activity, economic activity. But for inflation, it pushes inflation up. Okay. Because prices go up irrespective of what the real cost is because the people have money. They want to spend it. Prices go up. But in January, the story is going to change in January because the impact of the change in the currency, a lot of people would have now given up. Some of those fake currencies in the system will have problems. They have to go and use it to make firewood, okay? Because you're not going to get into the banking system because they're going to scan the money coming in. And then a lot of the monies are coming back too. And people do arbitrage. People are making money from changing currency and all that. They are now going to make money from people coming to deposit their money. Some of them are laundered money and all of that. You pay them 20% or 10% for them to put it for you in the banking sector. So, and then politics, they're sharing money to politicians. And then, of course, some of the politicians, that some of the laundered money, they rather buy dollar with it and send them abroad or put it in their domiciliary account or use dollar to settle. So all of those activities will still portend pressure. But then from January to February, when the election spend would probably have been over, then you can see the economy will start settling. Because you now know the money in circulation. Everybody have come to collect new currency, but some of them will still go and put them in the sink somewhere or in the drainage system, the new currency. But at least we will stop buying new currency, which will spread in parties.
Okay, Prof, let's take a look now at the multidimensional poverty report. What are your views around it? I analyzed it a day after the report was released. I broke the report down for our viewers to see. But what are your thoughts about this, very quickly? Now,
the multidimensional thing is really, it goes beyond UNDP Human Development Index. It goes beyond the World Bank Human Capital Development Index, because they are all looking at different sides of this. The other one's looking at infant mortality and age and all that. They're all looking at different parts of that same thing. But the multidimensional brings them all together and even brings more, like access to food and access to shelter and all of that, basic needs. So it brings all of them, the monetary and the money itself as well. So, but one remarkable thing about this is that it shows that not only that 63% of our population are in that bracket experiencing multi-dimensional poverty. And don't forget they use index, so which means that it's a collection of different indicators that you index. So that's what it tells you. So the fact that these states, certain states are poor, what do you call it? You have Jigawa and Bayelsa and all the Kobe. The fact that they are ranked poor doesn't mean that you got to be very careful in interpreting it, because there is a basket of indicators that you use to class them as poor.
But at the end of the day, you got an aggregate now that made them like Sokoto State 91% being the poorest state in Nigeria.
Yeah,
that means that they perform poorly in all the indices and they arrive at the final calculation.
I understand.
Yes.
But the intensity will be slightly different as per indicators. Because in one indicator, you could do better in one indicator, but it do terribly worse in the other. So by the time you average it, it comes.
Yes.
So it's difficult for you to say, well, Bayelsa is the most in what particular. You have to be a bit careful in reading the data. That's the point. Then it says something about the intensity, because the intensity is the one that connects to the how intense is it in particular a subgroup. When you say people living below poverty line, below poverty line is intensity. Below poverty line, because you're actually looking at one that says people who $1.2 per day and on that are classed as below poverty line.
But that was not what was used for this.
No, that's not what is used, but that is what it is similar to. The intensity of it is what's similar to. Then you also have the fact that there is a disaggregation of age, which shows that people between the age of 0 to 17 are disproportionately affected to a much, much higher degree. Now, that is very important, because in terms of policy, you know where to target the effort on poverty, on multidimensional poverty reduction. But also, it tells you the locational aspect, which is these are the northern zone are more over here, and then than the south, and then the particular states in the north that are worse. So you know how to target. But there is also another area, which is when you now disaggregate those who are poor, and then you find out that a much higher percentage in the poverty area, like 62%, are actually to do with those who, if you look at out of school, we take an indicator out of school children, and then go and look at multidimensional poverty incidence in out of school children, you find that about 90% are actually the people that are poor. So those who are out of school, an overwhelming percentage are people who are poor. So which means that if you want to target poverty and invest in human resource at the same time, target these people who are child poverty. Child poverty is the one that will deliver two things. It will deliver a general improvement in poverty alleviation, but also deal with the social disorder after all, those young people will become adults at some stage. So resisting adult poverty should not be your biggest priority. The biggest priority should be child poverty. Because the child will still become adult tomorrow.
Now, the interventions by the government to reduce child poverty include school feeding program.
That is useful.
Yes, include cash conditional transfer. Okay, see what happened.
That one's not for the children.
Yes, it's not for the children. What is really targeting the children is the school feeding.
School feeding.
Now, but if you take a look at free
education,
target them, which is by the states, which should be by the states.
Yeah, that should be. But don't forget that some of the states, if you look at UBEC, this is the universal basic education. They have a matching funding formula. So some states, you have to bring your counterpart to be able to download their own.
Okay,
so we have to deal with that. Whatever the states can use available, let them have it. I'm not saying cancel it completely, but let help go there so that they can take down all that there is within their destiny with the resources. How can you have UBEC having surplus money that has not been drawn down?
And you're having
because you can't have that. So we should target resources to make sure that they will draw them down so that the children will be in school.
Okay, very quickly, Prof, what other measures can be implemented now, between now and May 2023? Because President Buhari says he wants to lift 100 million people out of poverty. This report is not really looking nice for him. You know, it shows that even the World Bank in their public finance review said since 2015 that Nigeria has worsened so far in terms of development. So what other measures, can you give me 1, 2, 3 very quickly before we close?
But the other measures you have to connect with IMF recommendation, because IMF says increase VAT from 7.5 to 15%, so more resources to the government. But government additional resources should go to make sure that they exhaust the resources that should go to states to target the young people for their education. So it is about how you allocate. The other one is how you earn more. But they also say a bit more, like get out of this subsidy, fuel subsidy. Because for you to be gulping 6 trillion a year, putting in only 2 trillion would even solve our child poverty issue. But, you know, so you've got to deal with the revenue, increased revenue. So that's where there are, of course, they have other suggestions they gave. But at least those two are around the revenue, increased revenue. But in terms of government allocation of resources, they should ensure that those resources that are already available at the level of the UBEC gets down to the state. Even if it means subsidizing them and removing it, you have to get it down.
Okay. I will say thank you, Prof, for your submissions this morning. Thank you. Thank you very much. I've been speaking with Professor Ken Ifewu, is a development economist, and we've been looking at all the indicators concerning Nigerian economy. Of course, we've been looking at the macroeconomic indicators apart from like employment, inflation, and what the monetary policy needs to do to bring down inflation. Thank you all for joining us today. I am Nancy Naji. Be the best you can be, and be that change that you want to see by now.